I'd like to say we've appreciated having this book as a jumping off point to discuss issues of race and class with our library community. And it's been a wonderful way to connect both in person as well as remotely. So with that, I'd like to welcome Samir and thank you for coming.
Kim, thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here, and hopefully, as things continue to open up a little bit, we can all kind of see each other more and more. So I'm thrilled, and I'm particularly just so happy to be here through the library because libraries are amazing, and I totally grew up. When we first arrived in the early '80s in Northern California, I learned a lot of my English checking out Tintin books from the Richmond Public Library. And there's still something about how air conditioned that library was that kind of gave me the signal that this was a great place to hang out. So air conditioning, if libraries have more air conditioning, the better they will be able to kind of keep 9-year-olds in their chairs. So anyway, but thank you so much for having me, and thank you all out there. I think Kim and I are going to chat, but please, I think Kim mentioned it as well, but feel free to kind of pop questions into the Q&A, and there's nothing off limits. I'm happy to answer whatever you like, and if I don't feel like answering it, I'll just say I don't feel like answering it. So it's better to ask than to not ask at all.
Thank you, Samir. My first question is one that you must get asked a lot. We all want to know, we've been on the edge of our seats, how much of this book is true, and are you Raj?
Yeah, it is. It's funny. It is a really consistent question that I get, right? And I feel like if I was Raj, I'm not sure how many friends I would continue to have. And so, there are aspects of this book, right? And I think one of the things in some ways about a first novel, right? And I think that this is what happens with writers, is that the first novel is the place where you kind of download your emotional life, right? And it's because you've been waiting to kind of publish this novel. And, and there are all sorts of examples of really non-autobiographical first novels and then deeply autobiographical first novels, right? So what I will say is there are certainly aspects of Raj Bhatt's experience that is my experience, right? Which is, and we can talk about this more, but, the ways in which I conceptualize this idea of brownness in the book, my experiences at universities. I've spent my entire adult life, I realize at some point, at one university or another. It is the world that I know really intimately, right? And so, so that is one aspect of its autobiographicalness. I think the second thing I wanted to say is that emotionally it feels autobiographical to me, right? And I think in a way that is something that most writers will tell you, right? Which is that they are there is a emotional life that they are trying to work through, and the novel feels like a place where they can work that through, right? But with all of that said, I've just made up a tremendous amount of stuff, right? And I have made it up because, the novel demands you to make stuff up. Especially in this case where it's set over a week, right? Which is, of course, if all of this stuff happened to me in a week, I don't know if I could remain standing, right? Which is that there is a part of the work that novels do is they both adhere to a certain kind of reality and yet signal an artifice, right? To say, hey, some of this stuff is not quite as real as it would seem, right? And for me, when novels do their work the best is they balance the stuff out, right? Which is that they have a whiff of reality, so you can kind of place yourself in the character, and yet they take you out of that reality. And because you're reading a novel, right? And I think that this would be, and I think if I was Raj, in fact, in a world where memoir is probably a more popular genre than the novel is right now, I think I would have happily worked within that, right? And so there is kind of that aspect of it. And then there is the other part that I've been thinking about in terms of getting this question, right? Which is, I guess I will just kind of leave it more rhetorical than trying to answer it, which is there something about Raj's experience that leads to this question of whether I'm Raj or not, right? And that's something I've been thinking through a lot, right? Which is that what is it about, for example, minority writing in this country right now that we often will assume that the kind of the author and the narrator are the same, right? And I think that has kind of some aspect to do with oftentimes within that tradition, we think about the minority novel as a evidence of sociology, right? An evidence of, oh, this is how these folks live, right? And I think for me, as someone, the other hat that I wear is as a literary scholar, this is a deeply novelistic novel for me, right? And so I think maintaining that distinction between kind of who Raj Bhatt is and who Samir Pandya is, for me in my mind, is as clear as day. The fun thing for me is for it to not be clear as day for you, right? Is because then I can kind of maintain some of that mystery. So that was my kind of long-winded answer for that, but I think it is an important question that gets asked a lot and something it's given me occasion. It's unfair for me to say, oh, none of this is true, because that would just be false, right? But I also think conversely, to say all of this is true is completely ridiculous as well.
Our in-person book club discussing your book, some of the people that were there said these situations feel a little too real. Like they were like, this is kind of embarrassing to read it in a novel form and realize that these are things that happen all the time, and they, like almost like embarrassed because they saw it as being set locally, and I don't know if you've heard any questions about that.
Yeah, I mean, it is, I mean, there are a couple of things, right? So the thing about the embarrassment, I mean, the word that I get used most often is cringy, right? Which is the inciting incident of this novel is deeply cringy. I find it cringy, right? When I think about it, when I'm getting ready to do this event, I'm like, oh God, I'm going to have to talk about that moment. It makes my skin crawl.
No spoilers. Yeah.
Yeah, no spoilers, of course.
But yes.
But it's supposed to make your skin crawl, right? I mean, I think that's the point, is that it does make your skin crawl. And so point number one. Point number two, if it feels too real, then maybe I feel like I've done my job, right? So that's the hard part, right? Which was what I was nervous, Kim, you were going to say, is that in fact, it feels like too much artifice, like some of this stuff is made up, right? And I think that a part of the reason this novel is narrated in the first person is precisely to give the reader an opportunity to hang out in Raj Bhatt's head for a week, right? And to see what it feels like to constantly question yourself, to constantly kind of interrogate what you think, to constantly kind of try to analyze it with your head, to kind of deconstruct it with your heart, and to figure out what is up and what is down, right? And so I think that is what I was really, really trying to do there, right? Which is to kind of figure that stuff out. Now, the stuff about the local stuff, I will say, for people who live in this area, of course they're going to recognize it, right? And the one thing that I tried very clearly to do was I didn't name the place, right? I didn't name the town. I didn't name the university. Now, for those of you who live here, like I didn't do that great of a job of hiding anything, right? Like the joke that I get the most often is that I kind of redid art from scrap to scrappy art, right? Which is not my greatest kind of imaginative moment. But I think what's hard is when you set a novel in a very specific place, then you're responsible for getting that specific place right? So that I think, Kim, you could say, your description of what the ocean looks like is completely off because, the surf actually goes this way as opposed to this way, right? And so the second you set a novel in a place, in a very specific place, you have a very different responsibility. And that responsibility is, verisimilitude, of getting the details exactly right. I just needed a little bit more breathing room to make up stuff, to change schools, to to describe places in the way that I described them. And I think that once I did that, it freed me up. And I think what I'm hoping is this book then becomes not just about Montecito or Santa Barbara, for example, but I think that there are liberal spaces like this all over this country, right? They are in the Bay Area, they're in Los Angeles, they're in Boston, they're in Long Island. They are in every part of this country, right? And it was so interesting that when this book first came out, somebody got in touch with me on Instagram, and it was a guy who belonged to a tennis club in New Orleans. And he said, it felt like you were describing my tennis club in New Orleans. And I thought that was, I felt like I'd won if somehow this book could be a stand-in for New Orleans, right? Because I don't know New Orleans at all, right? And I mean, besides kind of what we see of it on television, I've visited there once. It's an amazing place. So I think I wanted to be a little bit kind of open about that, right? Which is that then it becomes less specificity and more of metaphor. And I think that that's what I was particularly kind of interested in going after.
Bring a little more New Orleans to Santa Barbara, I would be happy with that.
Oh yeah. I think we could all use with more, oysters and crawfish.
Right before COVID, and
yeah,
second line parade. We should just do that.
Oh, absolutely.
Well, my next question. Do you want to address the questions in the chat, or should we save them for the end? What would you
I mean, we can. Why don't you give me one more question? And then we can just kind of go back and forth. I think it's fairly easy. Go ahead.
So this book resonates with readers on many levels. Two in particular, I would say, being set on a college campus. Mm-hmm. A lot of people can connect with that. And then the main character being an immigrant in America. So can you discuss how you did that mashup of the campus novel and the immigrant novel, and if you were thinking of that in the front of your mind as you were writing?
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a great question. So in fact, this feels like my mashup of three types of books, right? And they're my three favorite types of books, which is number one, I love men doing dumb things books, right? So that's often the midlife crisis book. And for me, like the model for this book is Straight Man by Richard Russo, right? Which is, I think, is a really, really funny, it's also a campus novel, but a really, really funny, light book about, a man falling down, right? So even well before I hit middle age, I kind of liked those books, right? And I think there's, particularly in America, I think there's a really long tradition of that, right? Updike has plenty of those novels. Cheever has those books. Philip Roth, all of these kind of male white writers of a particular era were particularly interested in what to do now that we've achieved what we thought we were going to achieve, right? The immigrant novel is something I have been reading and I have been teaching, right? And so that has been interesting to me. But I think one of the things that I've found interesting about the immigrant novel and what makes an immigrant novel is this idea that you are from a place and you immigrate because you are looking for a better life, right? And so that when you come to America, you engage in certain kind of ways of talking, of dressing, of eating and working hard that will get you there, right? And particularly within the Asian American tradition, that's a pretty kind of consistent theme, right? Which is if you work hard enough, you assimilate, then you become this person, right? And you've all read it, right? It starts with the Joy Luck Club and it moves its way through Jhumpa Lahiri in all sorts of different ways. And they're all very complicated writers. I'm not saying that they're the same, that they're doing this. I wanted to mess with that a little bit, mainly because Raj Bhatt, when he grows up in India, does not grow up poor. He is deeply privileged, right? He is a Brahmin man, so he is very high caste. In fact, he says the thing that he loves about the TC, the tennis club where he's a member, it reminds him of the club he grew up going to as a spoiled kid, right? And so what I wanted to mess with a little bit is this idea that all immigrants and all immigrant novels are not about pulling themselves up by the bootstraps. It is, in fact, part of what happens for some traditions of immigration, and not all of them, is you lose status. And the crisis is the fact that you will never regain that status. And you will never regain that status is because if you are a brown or a Black immigrant, race is going to reshape the ways in which you will not have access to privilege in the way that if you're an Indian in India and of a certain means, you're going to have money, right? The third kind of tradition of this is the campus novel, right? Which is the one kind of is probably my favorite out of these, right? And, you know, I can be annoying and tell you all the ones that I love, right? From John Williams' Stoner to kind of Michael Chabon's Wonder Days to Straight Man, the one that I mentioned, right? And it's one of the reasons why The Chair, for example, this TV show has become—
I was going to ask you about.
And we can talk about it. It's become so popular, right? Is because what's happened with the campus is the campus has become like the canary in the coal mine, right? It's like, it's all of these debates we're having as a society are occurring on campus, right? And so I brought all of those three things together, but what I wanted to do, and this is why the mashup is so important, right? Is because in the traditional male crisis novel, there's always a white man at the center of it. I wanted to replace him with someone that looked like me, right? In the campus novel, the crisis is created by a character who has achieved and is now bored. And in fact, what Raj Bhatt is failed, that he has not achieved the kinds of things that he wanted to achieve, right? And the immigrant part is he comes with this privilege, and then because he's not achieved, he is just kind of fumbling along, right? And so when I say it's a mashup, what I found interesting about it being a mashup is that you get to mess with the assumptions of each of these genres, right? You get to say, this is what I loved about the campus novel, but this is how I want to see it differently, right? And so, you know, I come at all of these three traditions with a significant amount of affection, right? I don't want to say I want to get rid of them or I don't like reading them anymore. But I think, you know, there's some a quote from a Saul Bellow novel where, you know, there's a dog barking and kind of his owner says the dog is just kind of angry because, you know, the dog universe is not loud enough, it's not big enough, right? Which is he wants to be able to communicate. And I think that that's in some ways my version of barking is to just say, let's take these traditions and just open them up, because there's so much other interesting voices that can narrate these same stories that will lead us to really different conclusions and different possibilities.
Speaking of that, I have a question before we get to the chat question.
Yeah.
Do you see this being made into a movie or like a Netflix series or something? Because that a lot of people have talked about that too at book club and just at the library. They can see this becoming.
Yeah. I mean, you know, the thing is, here's the thing is that I think the hardest thing to do in a book is to write plot, right? Plot is so heavy, so difficult because it can just be, you know, when something is too plotty, it just feels like the artifice is too great, right? And so I think I just got lucky with the plot, right? In a way that I knew what Raj needed to do in the first 20 pages, and I knew how he was going to be 300 pages later. And the work of this novel was figuring out how to get him from page 1 to page 323 or whatever it is, right? And so I think what ended up happening, because it was a week and everything happens in this week and there are these moments of backstory, it just meant that it almost feels episodic in a way that a TV show is episodic, right? Which is, I think you could very easily have 2 episodes per day, right? Or it can be a film. So I will say, I didn't set out to kind of say I want to write a novel that would emulate this, because I think, or one where I would say, oh my God, it'd be so fun if this happened, because then it's just kind of, I'm opening up myself to disaster if I do that, right? Which is that if you know what you want a book to do before you've done it, I think it's just gonna topple over. With that said, there is, there has been some kind of fun conversation around the possibilities that it could be a TV show. So, that I will kind of just keep under wraps for a while until it is more public. But, it's an exciting part of this as well, right? Is because I think, there's a reason why there is so much conversation about the need for television and movies to be diverse, right? And I think after we get past the kind of buzzwords, where we're at is to say, in some ways, we're all telling the same stories over and over again. But when different people get to tell those stories, you get to kind of shine a light on a corner that has remained darkened for a long time, right? And so I think in that context, it's, it would be, I certainly didn't grow up watching TV shows with Indian men at the center of them who were not being made fun of, right? And I think that that's the thing, is that I would be so much more interested in a joke, in a show where the Indian character is not the butt of the joke, but the one who's creating the jokes. And I think that's exciting. It's a good moment right now, I think.
If you've gone back to watch movies and shows from your childhood with your kids, but I just watched Mean Girls on Friday with my daughters, and
how did that go?
It was interesting. I mean, I think they liked it, but I mean, there were some parts that were super cringy and just like don't translate very well, and a lot of just things that wouldn't.
It's interesting, is because there is. I tried. I tried watching The Office with them, and I think it's something about that humor just did not register, and I don't know. I feel like we've all hit a moment where we're like, holy moly, like there's a generational difference, and we're on the old side of the generational difference, which is not that fun, Yeah, exactly.
Mean Girls. There's one part, the phrase is in it, just so you know.
Oh, is that right? Yeah, and I'm sure. Yeah, its presence in it, in that version. That's like 20 years ago, right? So it's a very, very. It's like Tina Fey before we really knew Tina Fey.
Yeah. So let's ask the question in the chat now. I'll ask. So someone's asking about the audiobook. She enjoyed listening to your audiobook and enjoyed the narrator's range. The story was very interesting. How did you choose the meme of Haji to represent a generic male Indian person? And then there's more to the question, but did you want to?
Yeah, do you mind if I keep reading it? I'd like to read it aloud. Okay. Yeah. So this is Teresa Singh. So this is, I enjoyed listening to your audiobook. I like the narrator's range, and the story was very interesting. A great voice actor named Sunil Malhotra, who's wonderful. One item I wonder about: why did you choose the meme of Haji to represent a generic male Indian person? The image of a turbaned Indian used in such a manner seems to be a bit of irresponsible in light of the American post 9/11 experience of American Sikhs having made targets of anti-terrorism. Had you considered the effect of using this symbol on our Sikh community? Could you have used another meme to use the flyer described in the novel? Teresa, that's a terrific question, right? And I thought very carefully about making that decision, right? And I think part of that decision came from the fact that when I was texting with people, that meme is the only thing Apple provides as a meme that represents Indian folks, right? And so that was a kind of technologically a moment that I found interesting, right? Now, a part of the point that I'm making with the book, right? And I'm so glad you brought up 9/11, right? Is because in a way, this is this is a book that I have set, and I don't explicitly state it. I said it in the fall of 2016, at the end of the Obama term, when we all thought Hillary Clinton was going to get elected, when in fact Donald Trump would then get elected, right? And so it is a character who essentially comes of age in roughly the 15 years that passed between 9/11 and the election of 2016, right? Which is, I think when we look back on it, these 15 years will be deeply consequential in how kind of American life and American history has proceeded, right? One of the reasons I chose that meme was precisely because I think my experience after 9/11 was this idea where the complexity of being Indian was basically boiled down to wearing a turban, right? So that if you were Hindu or you were Muslim or you were Jain or you were Sikh, that what happened to being a brown body after 9/11 is that you suddenly became a terrorist, right? You became this kind of nondescript brown man with a turban on, right? And so a part of what happens is the students that use that meme and the people that use it online are in essence saying, we don't really care about who you are and what your history is. We think all of you are the same, right? And so I think I want to be very clear, Teresa, that this was not meant to be kind of insensitive to the experiences that Sikhs have had after 9/11, right? I know the first attacks that occurred after 9/11 that were against Indian and South Asians in this country was against a Sikh owner of a gas station in Arizona, right? And that history has been profound. But I think that part of the point that I was trying to make is that there's a way after 9/11 where all of this difference has been collapsed into this little meme, right? And I think it's, for me, a much greater reflection of what the experience of being South Asian in America has been after 9/11, as opposed to me kind of picking on one group over the other. So I really appreciate that question. And what I hope I can kind of convey to you is those little decisions I had to kind of work through quite a bit, right? Which is the writing of a novel is exhausting ultimately is because you're making 1,000 little decisions on every single page. You're deciding what to leave out, you're deciding what to keep in, and what happens when you make the decisions that you make. And I think that oftentimes, you go into a period of exhaustion after you finish the thing is because you just can't make any more decisions, right? And I think that, the pleasures in doing events like this and having a community like this read your book is it feels like you made some good decisions, right? And of course you make, and it's one of the reasons I'm not going to sit down and ever read this book entirely again is because I'm going to cringe myself because I'm going to think, oh, I can't believe I made that decision as opposed to another one. So thanks, Teresa.
I'll ask one more question and then we can go back to this one.
Yeah.
So one aspect of the book that stood out was Raj's relationships with his sons. And we talked about this a little bit before we started. It seems like our generation, which I presume we're in the same generation, Generation X, has changed its norms of parenting, compared to how we were raised as kids.
Yeah.
So you could share your thoughts about fatherhood with us.
Yeah. So, so thank you for that. It is, I've been thinking that I track my 14-year-old son, I track his telephone, right? So there is no part of a day when 13 or 14 hours that he's waking that I don't know where he is. I'm like, oh, look, there he is. Now he's going there. I told him not to go up that street, right? Now, what that is a certain literal helicoptering over a child, which I got none of, right? I arrived in this country when I was 8 years old, right? My father was 47, my mother was 40. They had to figure out how to make a living, right? And how to raise us and how to send us to college. And they were like, good luck, we're going to go work, right? And it wasn't that they were irresponsible, that they fed us every night, they clothed us, but they were just not around. And so part of what's happened is that we engage, and this is look, they had to make their decisions. I have the freedom to hover over my children because I want to hover over them. I like them and I want to spend time with them, right? And so that is kind of one of the generational changes that has occurred. But I do think that the second thing that I was really interested in with this book is I wanted to work through how, in this case, a set of parents, both of whom are working, both of whom are exhausted, both of whom are trying to love their children who are constantly exhausting them because they're children and they're young and they have demands and they have needs. And so the question is, that midlife crisis novels that I was talking about earlier, the other plot point for those books is the dude always bails. He says, I've had enough and I'm going to go now, right? And for me, I was interested in exploring what it looked like if you don't bail. And not bailing is its own kind of exhaustion, right? Is you're engaging with it in different kinds of ways. And I think there is kind of ways in which notions of masculinity have changed, right? I didn't, there's an amazing line, I think that, I don't know where it's from, I think it's from Lori Moore, where she says something about my father used to read to me silently from the Wall Street Journal. And it's a great line. And we don't read silently, right? We're like, can we read to you? Can we do this? Can we do that? And so I think I was trying to explore that. I was trying to explore the pitfalls of it as well, right? It's because at a certain point, they're going to become their own people. And if you don't get out of the way, I think that's also going to be a significant problem as well. So I think that's what I was kind of trying to explore. And, understandably, within literary fiction in particular, there's been such an amazing amount of books that have been published on the difficulties of contemporary motherhood, right? And not just now, but I think, in some ways, since second and third wave feminism, I think it has been a central aspect of American literary fiction, right? Which is writers trying to work through the demands they have as mothers and the desires they have as artists, right? And oftentimes that kind of conflict does not necessarily translate itself to a book where the character is male, right? And I think that's some of the stuff that I'm just interested in, right? Like most of my friends, they're as equally engaged with their children as their partners are, right? And I think it's one of the reasons why those are the people I hang out with, right? Which is you pick your groups because there's a certain level of similarity. And so that's kind of, I think, part of what I was trying to work through there.
Anything away, but I really enjoy the older son's character and some of the stuff he goes through in the book. I appreciated the way you wrote that.
Yeah.
Well, I'll go to the chat. Whoa, more questions. I think I'll read the question from Debbie. Sorry, my eyes are, I have to like go up and. One of my favorite novels is Fatima Farheen Mirza's A Place for Us, which made me see Muslim brown immigrants as people in a way nothing ever has. Is there some specific art which has impacted you in such a profound way?
Yeah, that's thank you, Debbie. That's a great question. And the Mirza novel is a beautiful novel. And I mean, in some ways, I think you're speaking to, I think you're speaking to the work that novels do, right? And which is, they do, in its most unsentimental way possible, they produce empathy, right? They produce a sense where groups of people who you see as cardboard figures suddenly become human with human needs and wants that are similar to your needs and wants, right? And I think the most profound work I think that novels can do for us right now, particularly when we seem to be really arguing with one another a lot, right? And not reading as much as we should, is this sense, right? Which is, and I do think that that's where kind of all of this conversation, we talked about this earlier, about diversity and things like that, become so important, right? Is because there is this, the novel, Debbie, is such a private experience, right? Before the pandemic, if there was a new movie, you went and saw it with 200 other people in a movie theater. If you're a person who loves plays, you went to a kind of a theater with other people, right? A novel is a deeply solitary act, right? Unless you read in a cafe or whatever, you're doing it on your own, right? You're not, and that's why in some ways this community reads things is such a great idea, is that you're doing this private act, but you're doing it collectively, right? So you can engage it in your own way and then deal with it in a kind of more public way. I think the book, and Raj Bhatt mentions it a little bit, which has been the most profound experience for me, is reading Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, right? That book for me has meant the world, right? And I think it means the world because on one level, I have no idea what the experience of growing up in the South in the 1930s was like, and moving to New York in the 1950s, and living in Harlem during this period of great change. This is both the life of Ralph Ellison, the novelist, and the unnamed narrator I am that Ellison has in his book, right? And yet, when I read that book, this is, as the kids say, it really spoke to me, right? Because this notion of invisibility that Ellison talks about, right? This idea that you're physically there, but the room doesn't seem to see you. And they don't see you because all they see is the color of your skin and not the substance of whatever is going on beneath there, right? And this 600-page novel concludes in the last line, and I'm not giving anything away, I promise, right? It's not a plot-heavy book, but the last line is, of this invisible man kind of sitting in this basement apartment in Harlem, and he says, I wonder if, and I'm paraphrasing, I wonder if on some register I speak for you all, right? And I think what Ellison does is he kind of puts his hand across and says, hey, Indian American guy who is 28 years old trying to figure out what is up and what is down, let me kind of bring you in for a little while, right? And I think that there is a way in which that feeling of connecting with Ellison, and then this notion that one could write about invisibility. And in my case, I think clearly the experiences of being Black in America in the middle of the 20th century are nothing like being Indian and brown in America in the early part of the 21st century, right? But I do think that there are some themes on belonging and being a part of a place and not being a part of a place that were really, really important to me. And I think, I could tell you 5 others, but I will just stop there and tell you that I go back to it. I have it very close to my desk because I can open up any scene, and there are some scenes in there. There's an early moment in the novel. There's a boxing match called the Battle Royale, which is, for my taste and for my kind of interest, the single most profoundly disturbing, profound scene in American literature, right? And it just works for me. And so that would be my answer to you, Debbie, that it was particularly important.
I'd like to ask about tennis.
Yeah, please.
Tennis it plays a big part in this book.
Yeah.
The game itself, as well as the club.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it drew a lot of people in that tennis ball, you know, like, in this community where we live. I mean, I don't know if we enjoy tennis, but how is tennis used as a metaphor and members only? Why did you choose?
I mean, let me say, first of all, I'm just going to repeat the question a little bit because I think Kim's audio is going in and out. So if some of you have not heard it, Kim is asking, why tennis, right? So at a very basic level, it's the sport that I started playing when I arrived in this country, right? There's a tennis court next to where we lived. I started playing, I played, and then I continued on. I played in high school. And I don't know, maybe it's because I grew up watching cricket and tennis seemed like the most kind of colonial or post-colonial version of the cricket that I grew up with. So at its most basic level, I absolutely adore the sport. And I adore the sport because, like most sports, it's profoundly simple, right? There's a rectangle. It's a tennis court here is the same as a tennis court in Cape Town as it is in Guatemala, right? There's no changes. Maybe the surface is different. And there is then so much variation that goes on, right? You can be kind of, the level I am, which is, whatever, I get by okay. You can be a beginner or you can be, Serena Williams, right? So there's all of these variations that are there. But the thing about sports is, in this country in particular, sports are always just metaphor, right? Football is kind of a metaphor for profound controlled violence, right? Baseball often is seen as a metaphor of, how democracy works, which is we all play our different roles, but hopefully we get together as a team, right? And I think it's one of the reasons why both baseball and basketball have had such a strong cultural hold on this country, right? Baseball, I don't think, is as beloved as it used to be. There's a reason why the NBA is as popular as it is right now, right? It's because kids see themselves in it. I see myself in it. My kids see themselves in it. But the main aspect of the metaphor of tennis that I wanted to talk about was, what I'm interested in is that the physical tennis court itself is a place of pure meritocracy, meaning you either win or you lose. You know how to hit a shot or you don't know how to hit a shot, right? So in that way, it is objectively, you can do it or you cannot do it. But the road to get to the tennis court is not full of meritocracy, right? So that the road that, for you tennis fans, Roger Federer and Serena Williams were born exactly a month apart. One was born in Michigan, the other one was born in Basel, Switzerland. One lived in Basel, Switzerland, the other one moved to Compton, right? They ended up at the same place. They took profoundly different roads to get there, right? And I think that that's what I find interesting about tennis, right? Which is that privilege operates in all sorts of different ways, right? And I think Raj feels both deeply comfortable on the tennis court and then at the same time really uncomfortable. And I think it's a discomfort that I was mainly interested in, right? Which is, how does it become the place where you feel certain things that you're not supposed to feel? And then the last thing I'll say about it is, ultimately, what he loves is just the way a tennis court feels. And this was purely autobiographical. There's not a day that does not go by when I step on a tennis court and I think, my God, look at this thing. It's a perfect place. Like the balls, I open a new can, I sniff it. Like, I'm like, my God, these things are like, there's so much possibility in a new can of balls. And of course, you become disappointed and sad a set later when you play terribly. But as long as there's early possibility, I'm good with that.
I don't know that my audio is going to be okay. I can't tell from my end. Do you mind reading the question from Fred?
Yeah. So you know what? In fact, there's a long question from Fred, which I'm happy to do. But there are also some shorter questions in the Q&A, which is
yes,
which I think we can look at really quickly.
Oh yeah, I like.
Yeah. So there's a question here. Vijaya is asking, how much did you borrow from Mindy Kaling and her TV shows? I think Mindy Kaling is such a profoundly talented writer, talented actress, right? I was watching some clips of The Office, which is, of course, where she kind of cut her teeth, right, as both an actress and specifically as a writer, right? I've watched Never Have I Ever with my kids, which maybe I shouldn't have, but whatever. It was COVID, and I think I think she is a really important presence in our popular culture. I am engaging with, I think, a different set of issues than she is, right? Like, in a way, I do think consistently the character that comes up in her stories, in her TV shows, are strong, smart women trying to make their way into the world, right? In a way, there's something very kind of Katharine Hepburn about Mindy Kaling, right? She just doesn't look like Katharine Hepburn anymore, right? And that is the charm of the shows, right? Which is these women are always kind of, people underestimate them. And I think there's so much more going on beneath them. And I think that's why the work she does is so important and interesting. And I think it also then speaks to our slight age difference, which is I'm older than her. And so I've found myself stuck in ways in Men Who Can't Figure It Out, right? Where her female characters, in fact, are just held back because they're so good and they're so strong and they're so smart, right? And I'm much more interested in men who just keep tripping on themselves, right? And don't mean to trip on themselves, but do nevertheless, right? And so, I think, Vijay, the other aspect of this is we just need more of these stories, right? Like, we can't just have Mindy Kaling telling the story of the South Asian diaspora. That diaspora is way too big. It is way too varied. It is way too complex. And hopefully what she does is, and I think it's really important, what she tells Netflix, like TV executives, is people like shows about brown folks living their lives in San Fernando Valley, right? And our viewing practices have changed. We've all changed, and let's kind of go there right now.
That's the next question.
So there are a couple of these questions here. To what degree is Raj's saga on campus a statement about generational stratification outside of race? So, JC, that's a great question, which is, I do think, I try to think, I've been trying to wonder that myself, right? Which is that that's something, there are some interesting differences between who I was as a college student 25 years ago and who my college students are now, right? They have very, very different ideas about things, about kind of irony, about pronouns, about kind of trigger warnings, you name it. There's all sorts of different things, right? And I think we're in the midst of those kind of generational conflicts. For me, what I was interested in this novel is, what do we do when there are these conflicts, right? How do we think about conflicts where there's no winner and loser, where the university, and if you forgive me for my slightly Pollyannish kind of attitude about this, where the university for me, and the reason why I've spent my entire adult life on a university campus, is it's a profound public square, right? We should be arguing. We should be disagreeing. We should be working through stuff out, right? And I do think that there are these major generational differences that are occurring. And maybe I think if we talk more about all of this, maybe we realize that they're not as specifically generational, or, it is kind of, I do, think about like all of these Bob Dylan lyrics where Dylan keeps saying, please get out of the way, right? Please, if you can't figure this out, please let us do this. And suddenly, like, I opened my eyes and I arrived at that moment where I'm the guy that Dylan was talking to 30, 40, whatever now, 50 years ago. He's like, get out of the way. And I don't fully want to get out of the way because I want to hang out here for a little bit longer. But I still understand that there are changes afoot, and we're trying to kind of figure all of that stuff out.
Question came up in book club.
About why Robert is there? Yeah. So Robert, for those of you who don't know, Robert is a character, a 19-year-old character who's white, who becomes particularly obsessed with Raj Bhatt, the character in this book, right? And there are two reasons why Robert is in this book, right? Is because I'm interested in this disaffection that is occurring amongst certain aspects of our population, right? Why are young white men angry, right? Why are they arming themselves? Why are they shooting things up, right? Why do they feel like their sense of possibility has been seriously curtailed? And why are they blaming people who don't deserve the blame for that, right? And so on one level, I think I was really, really interested in thinking through who that character is, right? But what I tried to do in the book, and this is not giving anything away, is in a flashback to 15 years before, when Raj is doing his field work in India, he meets a 19-year-old kid named Babu, right? Who is in some ways the Indian version of Robert, right? And I think what in fact happened in the India that I portray, it's the Gujarat and the Ahmedabad that I portray of the early aughts, is disaffected kids like that engaged in profound anti-Muslim violence in 2002, right? And so I think Robert is there for us to think about why these kids are so angry, and in drawing this parallel for us to think about, and this is this question that Raj asks at some point. He says, how far are we away from our own moments of communal violence, right? And I'm not pretending to be prescient about any of this, but when I wrote this book, and when I was working through its drafts, and when I was editing it in 2018, 2019, I didn't imagine Kenosha. I didn't imagine kind of what would happen on January 6th, right? I didn't imagine these moments of violence. And or in that kind of what these characters were kind of the quiet moments before something like that happens, right? And so that's kind of and Robert is also, as a plot device, he's also just the guy who has the potential to wreak havoc in this book.
I think we have time for one more question. So I haven't read Fred's question yet. Let me just take a quick look. Oh, okay. Sounds like it's actually not really a question, I don't think. I think it was sharing an experience.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, Fred, I mean, I think, I won't be able, I mean, I think you're speaking to, I think, an experience, right? There's a line that you say, I did not say a word and complied, right? And I think, and I'm sorry I had to read it as quickly as I did, but it's a line that stuck out to me the most, right? Which is what happens when you have to be silent in a particular moment, when you do not want to be silent, right? And when a social moment prevents you from actually talking. And I think that's in many ways what we are all haunted with, right? In a way. What I will say that I find profoundly kind of hopeful in this current moment that we exist in is, to the generational question that we had before, right? And about the generational differences, it seems like this new generation, when something is not working, they seem to say, okay, I think it's time for us to enter the streets, right? And I think we saw this in 2020, right? Those protests after George Floyd were profound. And I think, I don't know what kind of changes that they will instill, but people are out there. And I think I am still kind of, and I think in the novel, Raj Bhatt does a lot of this as well, right? He's like, someone makes a joke and he asks, like, how long have I stayed silent in jokes, right? Is because I think so often we value decorum over conflict, right? Especially in spaces that are supposed to be kind of a break from conflict, right? And I often think it's precisely those spaces, tennis clubs, campuses, golf clubs, all sorts of places where the conflict then bubbles over so much that something just kind of explodes. And I think we get kind of the moments that we get. We get this kind of moment that I'm trying to work out in this novel here.
Thank you, Samir. I think this has been a great talk tonight. I've enjoyed talking to you. If we could do it in person, that would be lovely. But this, to me, this is great. I mean, I've enjoyed this. I hope people that are watching have enjoyed it.
Yeah. No. So very briefly, I was just going to say, Kim, thank you so much, and thank you all. Thank you all for reading. Thank you all for engaging. And I think the one thing I was just going to very briefly add is, and it hasn't come up in this conversation, is I tried to dip my toe in humor with this book, right? Is because I think a part of what I realized is that some of this stuff is just so exhausting that if you can't, the laughter helps, right? And I think the sense of humor that Raj brings to his catastrophe is, I found useful, right? Is because I think we are kind of in a complicated moment right now, and sometimes the humor is as important of a rhetorical mode as being serious and engaging with the questions in a serious way.
It's brought a lot of people in. People have wanted to talk about the book. So thank you so much.
Excellent. So,
have a great night. You're getting a lot of accolades in the chat, but thank you very much. And thank you to everyone. I hope you can participate in our virtual book club coming up, and we'll see you at the library. Thank you.
Thank you all for spending Thursday evening with us. I enjoy your dinner or your drinks and everything else. So have a great night, everybody.